Hey everybody, I'm here with a review of the Star Wars book Dawn of the Jedi. Um, I would say this book is a prime example of what I point to when the usual suspects put the old EU on a pedestal and worship it as the be all end all of Star Wars canon, like it could do no wrong. This book, not so hot. Uh, Now, I do think it has some things working against it. It was obviously written in a way that they thought they were going to get to do probably a bunch of sequel books or at least a trilogy of sequel books because it ends very open. It doesn't have exactly the most satisfying ending. Um, the biggest hindrance to this book is the way it's written. Uh, it is flashback heavy. And I think it would have benefited from an editor kind of saying, no, let's, put this in chronological order. Because what tends to happen with this book is that it jumps around and not from chapter to chapter. Like you'll get, say, 25% of the way through a chapter, and then all of a sudden you're jutted into the past, which breaks up the pacing something terrible. Uh, the story's fine, you know. Um, it touches on some interesting things. You're basically following the story of this brother and sister. Uh, brother's thought dead. Uh, then it turns out, and this doesn't really spoil anything because this is all kind of revealed in the first chapter. That the brother once thought dead is actually alive, and he's trying to basically unlock hyperspace lanes, essentially. Like, this is pre hyperspace civilization. But in order to do so, he needs to do these things, and then he's got to muck about with dark matter, which could open up a black hole and swallow the system and all this kind of stuff. And, that's an interesting concept to explore. I think there's probably more interesting ways to go about it. Um, because the way they kind of go about it is essentially uh, the brother is not force sensitive, and since this is early Tython uh, civilization, at least early in the grand scheme of the Star Wars universe, um, they're all kind of like, being a force user is kind of part and parcel with being part of this, society and civilization. He isn't. He is definitely not force sensitive. He's not. It's not coming in, and he just builds up resentment and resentment until basically turns him into a monster. Um, but we never really get, you know, it's such it's not real. It's such a bad buildup for this character though, because outside of just having some resentment towards his sister being very force sensitive, it's really quite the jump. Um, like you get that he's frustrated with his situation, but to go from that to being kind of a murderous, obsessed madman is just kind of like there's no explanation. And this is where, like I said, it feels like this was probably the first part, what meant to be the first part of many. And of course, the problem there being is that you don't really get a full picture of things. Nothing ever really gels. Now, that's not to say that it is completely terrible. There are things to like in there. Um, you know, I think that there's some good action in there. I think they touch lightly on some of this stuff, um, where you really get a little bit of that exploration of early Jedi, but it's you're basically coming in where the Jedi have already been established. If anything, I'm thinking this is more building towards like the splintering off of the Jedi and the Sith. But because this is the first part of a book that never got the following series, it all falls flat. You don't really get to explore it fully. The title really is a misnomer. It's almost false advertising because you're not getting the Dawn of the Jedi. Just because you spell it differently doesn't mean that we aren't seeing an already established Jedi Order. So you're not really seeing the dawn of the Jedi. If we were going to do that, we would have gone all the way back to when the Thoyor first showed up on Tython. That would be the dawn of the Jedi. That would be the true dawn of the Jedi, and telling that story, I think, would have been more interesting. You could have self-contained that more and more. But instead, what we get is just this kind of middling, you know, kind of manhunt adventure, and it's fine. It's serviceable as is, but it's not anything I would ever revisit, and it's not really something I could recommend. You're better off just kind of getting a wiki read through of it, I would say. So those are my thoughts on it. Your mileage may vary, but it's not something I would invest the time in. Um, maybe if you want to speed through the audiobook, which is eventually what I did, because it just wasn't engaging enough. Even from a lore expanding perspective, it just wasn't. It just wasn't engaging enough. So, can't recommend it. Like I said, this is a prime example of when the usual suspects, crap on the new Star Wars because they herald the old EU. EU had a lot of stinkers. Had a lot of stinkers. This is one of them. Have a good one. See you in the next video.